Good morning. It is a pleasure to invite you to the Department of Surgery Grand Rounds. This week marks the second of 3 Grand Rounds this month with a diversity and equity and inclusion theme. Our department chair, Herb Chen, has made a commitment to recognize and promote differences within our department. One of his many action items was to create a vice chair role for diversity, equity, and inclusion, which I'm honored to serve with Dr. Sarah Pereira. In this role, we have created a committee of several members from our department as well as other surgical departments at UAB. The mission of our Diversity and Equity Inclusion Committee is to understand, promote, and respect diversity of background, culture, attitudes, and experiences within our department to drive excellence in clinical care, research, and surgical education. Outstanding clinical care and groundbreaking research are done here at UAB. Although many of our achievements have garnered national and international acclaim, we acknowledge that our primary duty is to serve our local community. And without the citizens of Birmingham and Alabama placing their trust in UAB, the excellent care that we provide would not be possible. The relationship between the city of Birmingham and UAB is inseparable and provides a historical narrative and foundation to develop a vision for mutual growth. Unfortunately, some aspects of our history are dark and painful. On September 15th at 10:22 a.m., that's 57 years ago today, a bomb was detonated on the steps of the 16th Street Baptist Church in downtown Birmingham. This explosion killed 4 young girls and injured 15 to 20 more. According to UAB archives, at the time of the explosion, our department chair, Dr. Champ Lyons, received a call from a church explosion resulting in multiple injuries. Fearing all hell was going to break loose, Dr. Lyons dispatched his residents to the local hospital. Chief surgery resident Dr. Joseph McDonald was assigned to work in a temporary morgue. His name appears on the 4 girls' death certificates. In the mob outside of the hospital, about 15 people were wounded in the explosion and another handful injured in street protests that clashed with angry white mobs following the bombing also made their way to the colored-only emergency room entrance. They faced a swarm of state troopers and city police as they barricaded the 6th Avenue South entrance. Dr. Holt McDowell, another resident, tended to the injured in the emergency room. An example of how the community events can and have fueled change within UAB is that in 1963, the first student of color was admitted to UAB, and in 1964, 44 students of color were admitted. In this time, there were still colored-only entrances and bathrooms for colored-only students at the time. The outrage and anger from the bombing of the 4 girls fueled UAB leadership to remove these signs and designations by 1965. By understanding the events of our past, we can continue to grow, evolve, and be better caregivers for our patients, especially those from disadvantaged and marginalized backgrounds. Dr. Pereira.
Good morning. I am honored and humbled by this opportunity to introduce Senator Doug Jones at the Department of Surgery Grand Rounds. Senator Jones has spent his life working to make Alabama a better place. He was born in Fairfield, Alabama, to a U.S. steelworker and a stay-at-home mother, and initially developed his love for politics through his volunteer work with campus affairs at the University of Alabama in a statewide campaign to modernize Alabama's court system. He graduated from Cumberland School of Law at Samford University and worked as staff counsel to the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee for Senator Hal Heflin, and later returned home to Alabama to serve as an assistant U.S. attorney. He was nominated by President Clinton to become U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama until 2001. It was in that position that Senator Jones successfully prosecuted 2 of the 4 men responsible for the 1963 bombings. This historic event has helped shape our local and national civil rights and led to the signing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 by President Lyndon Johnson. As senator, he continues to fight to increase access to affordable health care for every Alabamian and to make sure that every child has access to high-quality education. He has been awarded a National Rural Health Champion Award and was honored as Federal Lawmaker of the Year in 2018. A friendly reminder that this is an educational event. We will have a question and answer session at the conclusion of Senator Jones' presentation. However, he will not be taking any campaign questions. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Alabama Senator Doug Jones to speak at our Diversity Grand Rounds this morning.
Good morning. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. This is a somber event, and I want to just start by kind of juxtaposing where we are today with what happened in 1963. We're going to go through a lot of this, and I'm going to go through these very quickly, folks. We're going to put some slides up. Don't blink. You'll miss them because it's so hard to cut down on all of the information that we've had. But what happened in Birmingham in 1963 really changed America. And we see so many things today that are also changing America, and we cannot let these moments pass. What I'm going to do today is go through a bunch of slides. I'll get off there. You don't need to look at me. The slides tell the story better than anything. And it's a combination of where we were in 1963, what was going on leading up to this bombing in 1963. When I was just a kid, I was 9 years old when the bomb blew up. Really in a sheltered life out in Fairfield, Alabama at the time, segregated like the rest of Alabama, really like the rest of America. And it was not until high school, college, and law school that things really started changing for me. I'll tell you, as a second-year law student, the first of these cases got tried in 1977. A lot of people forget that. But then Attorney General Bill Backlash prosecuted the first of these cases, prosecuted a guy named Chambliss. I'll show his picture in a little bit. And as a second-year law student, I cut classes and went and watched the trial. It was amazing. Never dreaming that 24 years later, I'd have the opportunity as U.S. Attorney to finish these up and to finish the job that Bill did and try to bring some healing to Birmingham and Alabama. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what was going on before the bombing itself, a little bit about Baxley's case, and then into my cases, and we'll finish up. And I'm going to go through these. I'm telling you real quick. I've tried to cut this down some, but there is so much information that I would love to share in a much broader setting that I've done before all over the country, really, about these. So we'll go through these. I'm going to go to this screen now, and I'm going to click through these. Let me make sure I can. What am I doing here, Darren?
Select PowerPoint.
Where is it? There we go. Hold on, guys. This is new for me.
Yeah, open system. Open that.
I'm working on it. Okay. Okay, I hope y'all can see that. Well, wait a minute. Whew, okay. I hope you can see this. Doc, if you can see it, if you would just nod your head that you can. Okay, so here we go. First thing I want to do is talk about the church. The church was the center of this. It is the center of the story. We started with the church because that was the focal point. It was where so many of the mass meetings held. The church today, and I hope so many of you have been by that church. You really need to go. It's an amazing place. And the church today is very much like it was in 1963, except for one thing. If you look in the very bottom right corner here, you're going to see some concrete steps. Those were the concrete steps that led to the behind the church into the sanctuary. And just outside there was the window into the ladies' lounge. Those steps hadn't been there for 57 years now, since a bomb exploded that was placed under the very bottom step. But this story goes back to Brown versus Board of Education. That's when the story really it started. When the Supreme Court said separate schools are not equal schools. And we all know what happened. It took a lot more litigation, but there was so much violence that occurred as a result of school integration. That was the main thing. And this really had its genesis back during that time. It was 3 years after the Brown decision that Fred Shuttlesworth, and I'm not going to play this because it's a little long, But you see this still video, Fred Shuttlesworth, one of the movement's great leaders, tried to enroll his kids in an all-white high school in Birmingham, Phillips High School. Some of you may have even gone to Phillips High School many, many years ago. It's a prep school now. But when Fred Shuttlesworth tried to enroll his kids in Phillips High School, there was a mob of people waiting on it. They beat him with knives. I mean, they beat him with fists. They chased him up and down. His wife was stabbed in the hip with a pocket knife. But in that crowd, and you can't see him in this still shot, was one man who bragged about it later on, and that was Bobby Frank Cherry. That was one of the two guys that I prosecuted, Bobby Frank Cherry, and the other one was Tommy Blanton. This was kind of one of the first pieces of the puzzle in which pulling this together, because it showed the depth of violence that people would go to try to prevent black kids and white kids from going to school together. Now you have to fast forward from 1957, and a lot happened in Birmingham. The movement began to grow and grow and grow. In 1961, Freedom Riders came through Birmingham. They were beat at the bus station. And at that point, the city leaders in Birmingham, civic leaders, business leaders, not the political leaders like Bull Connor, decided that changes would have to come. And they went and they formed a new government. Citizens of Birmingham in 1962 went from a 3-person form of government to a mayor-council form of government. In the spring, in January of 61 and 63, that's when things started to happen. The movement was going to come to Birmingham. Dr. Shuttlesworth would talk to Dr. King about trying to bring the movement to Birmingham. The problem was Bull Connor was running for mayor, and they did not want to help him, so they delayed any marches in Birmingham. Then Bull Connor was in a runoff, so they delayed those again. He was defeated by Albert Boutwell, who was really the first more modern mayor of Birmingham. At that point, though, that's when the marches came to Birmingham. And it was the Children's March. It's called the Children's March because the meetings were held at the 16th Street Baptist Church. All the mass meetings, and the children would meet there. In 1963, this is the spring. And this was going to be a peaceful march, much like we're seeing peaceful marches across the country today. A peaceful march just for civil rights, for voting rights, to try to get equality for all Americans. And they were just going to march to City Hall. And they would meet at the 16th Street Baptist Church, where they would gather and they would pray and they would get their instructions. But as you all know from history, as soon as they left the church, they were met with Bull Connor's fire hoses and dogs. This was the picture that President Kennedy said moved him so much to move on the Civil Rights Act. At some point, there were arrests. Thousands of kids were arrested. So many that the jail in Birmingham was overflowing. They had to do a makeshift jail at Fair Park. What was also going on is that business leaders that had changed the government were seeing their city sliding away. And they met with Dr. King to make sure they could get this resolved. Bull Connor was on his way out, but they had to get this resolved. And this is Dr. King and Reverend Shuttlesworth, and Reverend Abernathy announcing a very modest settlement to end the marches. It would desegregate the lunch counters in Birmingham. It would allow the ladies who ran the elevators in the downtown Birmingham stores to become sales clerks, which was a pretty big deal. The city balked at hiring black police officers. That would not come for a number of years later. But even with this modest settlement in 1963, the Klan was not happy. This is Robert Shelton, who was the head of the United Klans of America, based in Tuscaloosa. Shelton said that night that he was the imperial wizard of the Klan. He said that night that the settlement would be Dr. King's epitaph. And sure enough, a bomb exploded at the A.G. Gaston Motel, which is under renovations now to preserve the A.G. Gaston Motel right by the Civil Rights Institute. It would be his epitaph. And that bomb exploded that night. And there were more bombings, because here's the thing. Even with that modest settlement, the Klan saw their segregated way of life sliding away, and they did not like it. And so they stepped up their violence. It's the only way they knew how to do it. 2 weeks after the settlement, Reverend A.D. King, the brother of Martin Luther King's home, was bombed in Birmingham. Birmingham had seen a lot of bombings over the years, but now they stepped it up. In June, Governor Wallace stands at the schoolhouse door, and as you know from history now, This was all to help his political career. He was never going to stop the Department of Justice from enrolling those kids at the University of Alabama. Vivian Malone and James Hood. The man with his arms crossed there is Nicholas Katzenbach. He was the Deputy Attorney General of the United States at the time, later became Attorney General under President Johnson. But when he stepped aside, when Wallace stepped aside, the Klan was unhappy. Their hero had let them down. There were armed Klansmen around Tuscaloosa waiting for the race war, which we now have heard too often in Charleston and other acts of racial violence in America over the last 3 or 4 years. But they were waiting on the race war, and so they continued to step up their violence. Arthur Shores, who was one of the great lawyers in Birmingham and later the first Black on the Birmingham City Council, his home was bombed twice that summer. But the movement continued to grow. In August of 1963, Dr. King delivered his I Have a Dream speech. And hope was building, 250, 300,000 people on the mall. And hope was building in Birmingham, but what was also happening was a lawsuit that had been filed after they tried to integrate the schools in 1957, finally came to a conclusion. And the Birmingham City Schools were ordered by the federal courts in August of 1963 to desegregate. And this was what was going on outside all of the white schools in Birmingham. The bus boycotts, the Confederate flags. And folks, I gotta tell you, you've heard so much about removal of Confederate monuments and names and the removal of the Confederate battle flag. This is why. I've got a paper, a Klan paper from 1965 that talks about how the Confederate battle flag had become a symbol of white supremacy, not of history, but of white supremacy. That is not a history class meeting outside of the high school there. That is a hateful rhetoric from white students who are bus boycotting. So a few days later, September the 10th, 1963, these two young men named Armstrong walked into Graymont Elementary School to desegregate Birmingham schools for the first time. That's Reverend Shuttlesworth leading, their father, James Armstrong, right behind them. And then the man on the left with the hat on was Oscar Adams. Oscar also one of their lawyers. Oscar later became the first African-American on the Alabama Supreme Court, was actually reelected on the Alabama Supreme Court on one occasion. Just a few days after this, Birmingham, I gotta tell you, was a powder keg at the time. There was a lot of tension, as you can imagine, with the desegregation of schools. And the Sunday morning of September 15th, there was going to be a youth service. Reverend John Cross, the pastor, wanted to have a youth service to bring the children back to Birmingham, back to the church for faith. And there were 4 members of the congregation that were going to participate. Addie Mae Collins, who was 14, went to Sunday school with her sisters that morning. Cynthia Morris Wesley, was living with the Wesley family because her mom couldn't handle all the children. She went to live with the Wesley family who brought her to church at 16th Street, got her into school. She was an incredible student. Then there's Denise McNair. Many of you in this room may have known Chris McNair. Chris was a photographer, took so many pictures. This was his favorite picture of Denise. He said it was his favorite picture, and it's why I used it, but I want to come back to it, hopefully, if we have time. She was the youngest, 11, almost 12, and then Carol Robertson. Carol Robertson was also 14 years old, a daughter of Al and Alpha Robertson, who testified in our case. And it was about 10:22. This is a clock across the street at Denise McNair's grandfather's. He had a dry goods and dry cleaning across the street from the church. Time always stands still, folks. And it did in Birmingham and it did in America on Sunday, September 15th. Reverend John Cross was the minister. He came back and testified in both of my trials. He had had a stroke and was in bad health, but insisted on coming back because he'd always lived with the guilt of having these children's death. It was a powerful bomb. What you're seeing here is if you look to the right, that open area was a door leading to the back of the sanctuary. And there were steps that went straight down toward where those men were standing. And that was the window outside that went into the ladies' lounge. It's a powerful bomb. It blew out the windows. It damaged the cars that were parked there. You can see the projectiles that went through that car. All of the windows across the street were blown out. It was a very powerful bomb. It was important to show this because there was some thought it had been thrown from a car that had been seen. This bomb was too big to throw from an automobile. It had been planted in the night. Inside the church, the adult Sunday school classes were meeting in the sanctuary. There were a number of injuries. Fortunately, none of the folks in that sanctuary were injured bad. It blew through 18 inches of concrete right into the ladies' lounge. And that's where the ladies, these children were gathered, simply to get ready for this church service. It completely destroyed the wall that shows the exposing the steps leading to the sanctuary. And this picture here, there's a sink that you might can see. I hope you can see it in the middle. It is part of the story later on. Outside the church, this is the most famous picture. You know, the civil rights movement grew up in the black churches. And for this photograph to be shown around the world with the face of Christ blown out, the only significant damage, has significant meaning then and even today. The Klan was responsible. Everyone knew there was a group of Klansmen led by this man, Robert Chambliss. He was who was prosecuted by Bill Blaxley in 1977. He worked for the city of Birmingham, and he was part of a group that met underneath the Cahaba River Bridge. They were known as the Cahaba River Bridge Boys, and it included Tommy Blanton. This is a photograph of Blanton when he was interviewed by the FBI in 1963. A photograph of Blanton at one of the hearings right before he was tried. He was 23 and a true hater, as was Bobby Frank Cherry, the truck driver who we prosecuted in 2002. It's a photograph of Cherry at his trial. And as I said, these folks met under the bridge. Y'all have probably crossed this bridge, either the bridge itself or the one above it going out Highway 280. They would meet under this bridge like a bunch of trolls, and that's where this bomb was planned. That's where they would meet to plan their mischief, as well as the modern sign shop. And there was a lot of activity at the sign shop as well as the bridge the weekend of these bombings. And it's important because there are two more pieces of the puzzle. When we finally got these indictments in 2000, we had to separate the trials. There was an issue about Cherry's competency. And we separated, we went to trial with Blanton first. And we had a number of the same witnesses, including Miss Robertson, the daughter of Carol Robertson. She testified she was at home when the bomb exploded just a few blocks from the church, and it sounded like the whole world was shaking. And truly that's what happened. The world did shake with this bombing as people asked why. How could this happen, even in a violent racial city like Birmingham? How could this happen with 4 innocent children die? We had the families. We had Junie Collins, the sister of Addie Mae, who talked about going to church that morning and how she had to later on identify the body of her sister, Addie Mae, at the makeshift morgue. Eunice Davis was the sister of Cynthia Wesley, living apart, had to get her mom to go to the Wesley's house that afternoon to learn how her sister had died when she heard it on the radio. Maxine McNair had taken Denise that morning. Her husband, Chris, went to a different church. She took Denise and parted, and when she was in the choir loft where her Sunday school class was meeting and the bomb exploded right below her, she just simply, I asked her on the witness stand, what was it like? She said it was bedlam. People were hollering, they were screaming, and we didn't know if it was a bomb or if it was a plane. I said, what did you do, Miss McNair? She said, I just screamed, my baby, because she knew that Denise was right below her. Chris McNair went to a different church. He was a Lutheran and went to a different church and had to go get identify the body of his daughter, still with a piece of mortar buried in her head. There were a number of witnesses. Bobby Frank Cherry gave us the first clue because he indicated, this is a press conference he called. And he said in his press conference that he was not a member, but he identified himself as being part of the group that bopped those Shuttlesworth. We had his granddaughter, Teresa, came. She testified, came from Texas, talked about how Bobby Frank Cherry continued to brag about the bombing over the years. We had his ex-wife, Willadine Brogdon, who talked about how Cherry would brag about bombing the church. It was one time when her car broke down, and he pointed to the area of the steps where they said that they planted the bomb, and that he would always say, kill before, and he would kill again. This is a crazy story that I hopefully will tell y'all some other time of how she got there, but I had to I had to let her drive all the way from Montana, but how she saw this in a newspaper in her hometown in Montana and called us to come and testify. Michael Goins testified about Cherry's bragging. They would keep cleaning carpets in 1980 in Texas. And there was complaining about the rise of the Hispanic population, such an important piece for where we are today. Complaining about the rise of the Hispanic population in 1980. And Cherry says we need to take care of the Hispanics the same way we took care of Black folks in Birmingham. Of course, he used all of the racial slurs, and he talked about bombing the church at 16th Street and killing those girls. The man you see with the bullhorn was James Lay. James Lay was a civil defense guy. 2 weeks before this bombing, he's traveling by the church at 1 in the morning, and he sees a car, and he blows his horn. They go away, but he later identifies the two people that he saw. One guy by a car that he identified as Robert Chambliss, the man that was standing by those very same steps holding a grip or a gym bag. He identified as Tommy Blanton. That's pretty strong circumstantial evidence. We had his testimony. Blanton's car had been seen at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the morning by this lady, Gerthus Glenn. She had died, and so I couldn't use it. But the fact is, we were able to get into evidence the fact that Blanton's car had been seen at 2 o'clock in the morning, because he had denied consistently ever being a part of that. Then there was Mitchell Burns. Mitchell Burns was an informant for 2 years. He ran with Tommy Blanton and made sure and tape recorded him. There was a tape in the car. And we never got on tape a specific admission from Blanton, but he would always talk about things he would do when he bombed his next church. He would always laugh and talk about it. There was one time when they went to pick up Bob Chambliss, and he said that this was the alley that they had missed the night that they bombed the church. Inside, and this was not on recording, but Mitch remembered it, that Cherry said, yeah, that he had talked about and bragged about lying to the FBI, and that he had thrown the FBI off about where it was, the bomb was made. This man was a FBI, not an agent, but he worked in the technicians. His name was Slim. They called him Slim, and he put a bug in Blanton's house. And I can't go through the tapes because we don't have all the time. But in June of 1963, they caught on tape a Blanton conversation with his wife, who was his girlfriend at the time. She was asking him what they did at the river. Remember, we were talking about the river and what they were doing at the river. And she talks about, he says they were interested in the meeting. And he's talking about the big one, the meeting where they planned the bomb. And then she refers back about, what are you talking about? And she says, we had the meeting. This is all on tape, folks. The meeting where we make the bomb. He talked about Modern Sign Shop, you know, and making the bomb. People at Modern Sign Shop said you weren't there. And then at some point here, she talks about lying to the FBI. This was an amazing story, folks. And I got to tell you, his girlfriend kept him out of jail for a long time until confronted with this story. And then she could not testify. Of course, they'd been divorced for a number of years. Final thing before we can get to a few questions I want to tell you about. We were racing against time, as you can imagine. This was 1997 when the case was reopened. We didn't indict until 2000. We tried Blanton first, and then we tried Cherry in 2002. I was actually an assistant deputy attorney general for the state of Alabama, even though for the first case I was still U.S. attorney. But we were racing against time, and I'll show you. James Lay had a stroke right before the Blanton case, but he still wanted to testify. We had been prepared to bring him in, but I was worried about him. We had an FBI agent that talked about the lies that Blanton had given earlier that was in Tampa, and he ended up being in the hospital in the middle of a trial. And I got worried about James Lay, so I didn't call him. And we read his testimony with a deal. And the point I'm making on a very short version of this is that 30 days after the Blanton case, the guy who had seen Blanton there, 30 days after the conviction, James Lay died. It was another year that this FBI agent passed away after testifying in the Cherry trial. Miss Robertson died the summer after the Cherry trial. Mitchell Burns died right before Thanksgiving after the Cherry trial. All of these people, and it included Reverend Shuttlesworth, it included Reverend Cross. Michael Goins died a year after the Cherry trial. All of these people, in all candor, folks, it was just seems to me like God kept him on this earth in order to complete this mission. And finally, that's Reverend Cross again. Eunice Davis passed away, Reverend Shuttlesworth. And then in 2005, Bobby Frank Cherry died 3 years after being convicted and died in Holman prison. And folks, I want to come back to one thing that I talked about that I think is so important, and that is the sink. People often forget there were 5 little girls in that ladies' lounge and one survived. And she went over to the sink to wash her hands. Sarah Collins Rudolph was the last witness I called in both trials. She was about 13 years old, sister of Addie Mae. And she was going to go wash her hands in the sink, and she turned around and I asked her, what happened? What did you see? She said she saw a picture of, she said she saw her sister tying the sash of Denise McNair's new dress. And then what happened, Sarah? Then there was the bomb. And I couldn't see. I was buried underneath rubble. I couldn't see. I couldn't hardly breathe. I said, what did you do, Sarah? She said, I called out for my sister. I called out, Addie, 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 her voice rising each time. Did you hear her or see her again? No, sir. Did you hear it? No, sir. Did you ever see her alive again? No, sir. And with that, the state of Alabama, my case, we rested the case. It was a remarkable ending. It took the jury only about 2 or 3 hours to convict Blanton. It took about 7 or 8 to convict Cherry. And at the end of the day, I came back to this picture because I told the jury in the Cherry trial that this was more than just a picture of a daughter of Chris McNair and her best friend, a white chatty Cathy doll. It's a picture of hope that we can all get along better together. And people like Cherry, people like Blanton tried to kill that hope, but hope's a good thing, maybe the best of things, and good things never die. And folks, we got to continue to have that hope today. As we have our racial reckoning today, some 57 years later, it's still important to understand and fully appreciate that we still have a long ways to go. We still have a long ways to go. There are so many things that we can learn from this. But the fact is, we've got to let this new generation stand up, speak out, to cause that good trouble John Lewis talked about, so they can get across the finish line what the multi-generational failures have failed to do. We can do it, and Birmingham and Alabama can lead the way. So that is a real quick version of the story. I appreciate so much you're joining me today and let me hear it. And I know we have a few more minutes. I have as much time as y'all want to stay on. I know you've got to go and you got things to do. Let me say finally, thank you. Thank you from America. Thank you from Alabama. Thank you from all the citizens. You guys have been the greatest generation. You've been on the front lines of this pandemic. Together, we're going to get through it, but I'm there for you, and I've been working hard for you. But thank you all so very much for what you do every day, but especially during, before, during, and after this pandemic. Thank you very much, Doc. Thank you.
Senator Jones, thank you very much for that moving story and for your honesty and the details. We have a few minutes for questions, and if any of our participants have questions at this time, please enter that in the chat. Senator Jones, I'll start. I just wonder if you could take us into sort of your thoughts, your mindset when you decided to take the trial. Sort of what things did you weigh, pros and cons? What fears, concerns did you have when you decided to take the trial?
Yeah, the biggest fear we had was of a hung jury. I knew I had enough that we were not going to get an acquittal. I mean, we had put this case together, but the fear was a hung jury and having to try it again. So we spent a lot of time with jury focus groups, trying to make sure that we set this the right way. You know, my biggest fears were kind of realized for those of you who were in Birmingham during these trials. You know, we had a problem about Cherry's competency, and he was initially ruled incompetent. That created a lot of backlash, on the government, a lot of protest. But at the end of the day, this was a case that was not a surefire winner. We knew we had the evidence, and it was just the right thing to do. We had to try to get these guys. We knew they did it. We knew from all the evidence. We also had a lot of evidence we couldn't use, you know, informant evidence. So we were very sure about our case, and we knew it's a case that just had to do. And we knew that Birmingham and Alabama needed this. Birmingham's images, even in 1997 when we started in 2001, the images of Birmingham were still in black and white photos of dogs and fire hoses. And I think we really helped change that image to show Birmingham as a city of diversity in full and living color.
Senator Jones, thank you so much. Your slides were so powerful, and the photos were really simply amazing. You played a critical role in this prosecution, and it's now been 57 years. And in reviewing some local history for your presentation today, I am amazed that 57 years later, we still have horrible events of racism in our country, such as the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor deaths. And I'm wondering what each of us can do in the very near future to create an anti-racist climate for not only our local city, but our university, state, and country.
It's a great question. You know, from the legislative standpoint, I think we've got to do a number of things. I think we've got to we really do have a problem in law enforcement. Overwhelmingly, law enforcement are really good, and we need law enforcement. We can't defund the police. But that's a most visible thing that we can do in Congress right now. But it seems to me that we've got to make a concerted effort. We've got to get outside our comfort zones to make sure that we reach out. We got to support those that are giving peaceful demonstrations. Unlike putting fire hoses and sticking fire hoses and dogs on folks, we've got to support those who are standing up and speaking out. We've got to support those who remove the Confederate battle flag. People like NASCAR that's done that. People like the state of Mississippi that's removed the Confederate battle flag. We've got to stand, there are symbols that we've got to do, but we cannot let removing those symbols get in the way of removing the barriers. And you can do it at UAB, you can do it in the state by supporting diversity, doing the very things that you're doing right now, by supporting diversity, by questioning sometimes why there's not more inclusion. And you know, the city of Birmingham is a partner now with UAB and some of the biggest companies in Birmingham to make sure they include more minorities on their board of directors. They mentor more business entrepreneurs. We've got to encourage entrepreneurship and give access to capital for business leaders, minority businesses. Those are the kind of things that we can do, I think, from afar. But the main thing is it's got to come from a heart. It can't come from legislation. It can't come from UAB college policies. It's got to come from people. And we got to challenge people, but do it in a nice way, in a peaceful way, to try to get folks together. We've got to get, again, for so many people, this is getting outside their comfort zone, but that's what we've got to do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Jones. We have some questions from our participants. The first one is from Sharon Samuel. Thank you for your presentation. During the trial, did you receive any threats or backlash?
Great question. And the answer is no. We were expecting some, but we didn't. I'll tell you, I received a little bit more threats. For those of you that were around during that time, you know, there was a bomb that exploded right there by the UAB campus at a women's center in 1998, right after I became U.S. attorney. And that's crazy right-wing militia type groups. We had several things that happened then. But by this time, we had not. Bill Baxley, when he had prosecuted the case, and Bobby DeLauder and others that prosecuted some of these cases in Mississippi had a number of threats, but we didn't get anything. We didn't get anything really but from support. The only real pushback, there was some conservative talk radio that pushed back a little bit saying, why do we need to do this? We don't need to go back and, you know, we've moved past the fire hoses and dogs, which is true. We had moved past fire hoses and dogs, but not everything else. But they asked, why would you go, these are old men, why would you go back and relive this? We didn't hear that after 9/11. These two prosecutions, Blanton occurred in May of 2001, Cherry in 2002 with 9/11 in between. We didn't hear anything about not going back and prosecuting old terrorists after 9/11. So it was really, we had nothing from support from the greater Birmingham community. And I was very grateful for that.
Senator Jones, a follow-up question by James Ferguson. He's wondering, why did it take nearly 40 years? Was there new evidence that was found in the time between the bombings and your work in the case?
There was no new evidence by the time that we reopened the case. There was a series of events, and then you really have to go back to 94 in Mississippi when they reopened the Medgar Evers murder and they convicted Byron De La Beckwith. When that occurred, people across the South, a new generation of prosecutors, law enforcement who knew that the justice system had let down so many people, started taking a look at other cold case civil rights cases. And in Birmingham, the FBI had kind of become at odds with the Black community over some investigations. And a new FBI agent in charge reached out to the Black community. And this was in 1996. And they asked him to just take another look. He saw some things that they could really do, but we really didn't have any new evidence. We tried to get a bunch, and the most new evidence that we got was the admissions that Sherry had made during the time. That we didn't have DNA, we didn't have explosive evidence, we tried to find that, but it was really repackaging. The one thing, that tape recording that I didn't get a chance to play for you, but the transcript, that couldn't have been used in the 1960s. The law changed just enough to where we were able to use that. And it was a damning piece of evidence against Blanton and Sherry. So that was really, and it was a change in the law, but not finding new evidence. But it was really repackaging. But the main thing, in all candor, the main thing was a change in Birmingham, a change in the makeup of a jury. They could have never convicted these folks in the 1960s, even with the evidence that I had, even with that. So it was a change. Thanks to folks at UAB, thanks to the business leaders in this new generation. It was a change in the makeup of the jury more than anything that allowed these prosecutions to go forward and justice to finally be achieved.
Yeah, we have one more question. Was any corruption associated with the first investigation immediately following the church bombing addressed in the sense, were people specifically punished because of corruption?
I don't know if there was any corruption there. We never really saw any corruption. You got to remember that in those days, the Klan was they were members of the police department, the sheriff's department. So, and Bull Connor was just an avowed racist. So I don't think there was any real corruption. We didn't really see any corruption. What we did see was in the state of Alabama, remember, this was a murder case. And that's why we had to prosecute these in state court, because there was no statute of limitations for murder. And so what we just saw was a complete lack of interest from the state. There was so much time and effort by the city of Birmingham at the time and state authorities. Wallace was governor, remember, state authorities. Their whole theory was that folks in the Black community bombed that church in order to help the civil rights cause. You hear those weird conspiracy theories today, but it existed then. So we really didn't see any corruption per se. What we just saw was a governmental hierarchy and law enforcement state that just decided that they weren't going to do it. From the FBI standpoint, let me say, I know the history of J. Edgar Hoover. I don't like him, never have liked him. But J. Edgar Hoover really put a lot of resources to do this. But for the local FBI agents, we couldn't have done it. We really built on what they did in 1963. Hoover threw resources at the investigation of this, not because he was a friend of the movement, not by any stretch, not because he cared about the deaths of these girls. He didn't. But in his words, and I got the documents to show this, in his words, the reputation of the Bureau was at stake. And that's Hoover's reputation, and the Bureau's reputation was all he cared about. And so he really threw a lot of resources. The times were just different, and they just couldn't never do it. And then it just got, like so many cold cases, put on a shelf and people moved on.
Senator Jones, if you don't mind 2 more minutes of your time, Dr. Altman has a question. He's wondering what your impressions are of the DC, Seattle, and Milwaukee protests currently in view of your prior experiences.
Yeah, well, I think it's unfortunate that there are anarchists and there are bad people that seize and take advantage of any demonstration like that. I think folks need to be in the streets. I think they need to be protesting when they see things happening like what happened to George Floyd or to Breonna Taylor or Jacob Blake. There is no question in my mind about it. But just like the peaceful protests that we saw in Birmingham, just like the March on Washington, there was no reason that John Lewis should have been beaten with a billy club by a state trooper simply by kneeling down and praying and trying to march from Selma to Montgomery. Those need to be peaceful protests, and they've gotten out of hand. We've got to try to figure out ways that the peaceful protesters can overcome that, to stand up and speak out. I really believe there's a clash of First Amendment. but there are bad people that take advantage of that, and those people should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. But folks are going to continue to speak out. I mean, look, we have got a problem that has got to be addressed. It's not in every department, and it's certainly not every law enforcement officer, but you can't not see what's happened. You cannot see that Jacob Blake being shot 7 times in the back at point blank range when he was unarmed, that we got a problem, and it's got to be addressed, but people need to get out of their corners on this and talk to each other. I was in law enforcement. I support law enforcement, but I also, and I know that there are things that law enforcement can do to help get past this process. The one thing I'll tell you that I worry about a lot when I see these protests, I worry about the anarchists, I worry about the people taking advantage. But when I see police officers that are generally unmarked in battle fatigues, looking like they're going to war in the Middle East somewhere, in Afghanistan or Iraq, that is not a de-escalation of tensions. We've got to figure out how to move past that and get the police back into the community, talking to folks, and get the community talking to the police. Those are the kind of dialogues we have to have, for sure. It's a real problem in this country right now, and it's gonna get worse, I'm afraid, between now and the election, because there are those in the country that want to stoke those fires, and that is so wrong and so inappropriate.
If you would allow us, sir, we have one last question, and Dr. Pereira is going to wrap things up.
Sure.
This is from an attendee. The blown out face of Jesus is the most powerful image, which symbolizes the disappointment of the events of racism then and now. This is the first time I've seen it. Why is this not an image shown more often? It should be shown every day, today and tomorrow, is what the panelist stated.
You know, it's a great question, and I've not thought about that, and it probably should be, because it is a powerful symbol. You know, after that, they replaced it, and it's repaired now, and the people of Wales donated another stained glass that's behind the balcony at the church now. But it's a good point. I show it all the time when I give these presentations. But maybe I need to start, because I've been standing up, I've been speaking out, I've been talking about it. And I'm doing a thing tomorrow at the prayer breakfast, for the Senate prayer breakfast. And I've already given this talk to my colleagues, but I've got some other things I was going to talk about, and I will, but maybe I need to come back to this, and maybe it's an image that we need to talk about, because as John Lewis said, we've got to do more to really achieve the beloved community that Dr. King spoke about. And love has got to triumph over hate. And for those people of faith, even if it's not the Christian faith, people of faith have to understand, and I've said this before, that there's such a powerful image of that face that's not there, almost as if Christ is saying he can't bear to see what his children are doing to his children. And you've really given me something to think about, and I really appreciate that. So you may see it a lot more through Birmingham and other places. Thank you very much for that.
Senator Jones, on behalf of the Department of Surgery and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, we really appreciate your time. This has been personally very powerful for myself, and I'm almost speechless at some of those photos as a mother and a surgeon, and thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure to be with you. But again, thank you guys for all that you're doing. Thanks for being there for us throughout this whole problem. And I know you're going to be there for everybody when we get on the back of the end of this pandemic. And I'm working hard to try to get on the back end as soon as possible. So thank you all at UAB. I love you guys. Take care.
Thank you.